I'll now open the floor for comments, questions.
Thanks, Kaneesha. That was really interesting. I just wanted to know if you had anything more to say about the sending of the spirit and bathing, that kind of ritual aspect.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was an interesting kind of syncretic moment, and if you had explored that some more, I'd like to hear about it.
Thank you, Crystal. That's a great question. I haven't specifically explored bathing or that sort of ritual practice, but it does remind me of another novel that is really kind of central to the way I think about, in other parts of my dissertation, collaborations between African and Indian women. So David Dabadine's The Counting House, in which an indentured Indian woman is the companion of the planter, and when she becomes pregnant, she seeks an abortion, and the African woman with whom she's friends and with whom she previously had a kind of rivalry, she not only bathes her, kind of seeking to kind of cleanse her in a more ritualistic way, but also gives her abortifacients that she picks from the garden about the plantation. So it is a question that's kind of present in the broader kind of scope of my work. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kaneesha. It was really great. I'm looking forward to the whole dissertation, reading it. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about love work. That was really important conceptually for your project and for how you're reading the characters, as opposed to something like love power, which some feminist theorists have been exploring around a different way to think about how women negotiate gendered relationships. But I really like love work, especially in your thinking about modes of exchange. So I wonder if that's something you use in the rest of your dissertation, if that term comes up at all.
Not explicitly, and thank you also for your engagement. But more recently, I've been returning to, I mean, as always, Black feminist, Caribbean feminist theory of various kinds to think about domestic and sexual work, and also in conversation with kind of North American feminist theory to think about the terrain on which feminist theorists in various locations have thought about domestic work in relation to capitalist labor and how that is unacknowledged. And so, no, it doesn't appear in my other chapters. No, not explicitly. This is the chapter in which I kind of explore that in relationship to wages and the work week and labor. So
It could be interesting.
yeah, that's true.
And also I was thinking about Toni Morrison says in the beginning of Sula, she says that female freedom always has to be seen in the prism of sexual and economic freedom, right? And I thought about that a lot as you were talking, how she sets up, she sort of writes the preface for her later edition and says, people misunderstand Sula for these reasons, and this is sort of how she sees the complexity of the character Sula and the choices she makes. And I thought that would be, something interesting to think through, because it's about love work. It's about those sort of modes of exchange, and particularly for the women characters, how they see their work and how you're reading it against how other people have read it. I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, that's a really helpful quote, and that kind of vision of sexual and economic freedom that Toni Morrison is trying to outline through Sula kind of upends the kind of flattened figure of the bad woman that we see in African American and Caribbean literature. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for it's an interesting reading, and I must say I don't know the second short story, The Dougla, and I will certainly try to find it and have a bit of it. something I'm wondering. I wasn't clear if you said that even though she appears to be in love, it is not that the love is not effective, but it is also a form of work. So are you saying that it is affective and it is a form of work? That's what you're saying?
Yes, yeah.
Right. That is a very... You raised several issues that I found very interesting, and a couple of which I'm not sure I heard the resolution of. So the notion of love as being affective as well as a form of work. My experience of that, I do remember someone, she would have been the age of my grandmother, a very starchy, very proper, brought up by her relatives, the descendants of the French Creole. She had what you would know the notion of a French Creole background. So that's a whole paraphernalia with all the lace cloths and the embroidery and the drawn thread and the what and what and what. And she lived what appeared to be an extremely respectable life, except that she often would say, in a very odd sense, she used to say, every woman is born with her big money, she just has to decide whether to work it or not. So that was a very contradictory, to my mind, a very contradictory thing. And she wouldn't even say it as if she was laughing. It wasn't like, it was just, this is how life is. Every woman is born with her big money, she just has to decide whether to work it or not. And she would say to us, we were like her grandchildren, to very young girls. At the same time expecting us to be perfectly respectable and what and what and what. Okay, so it seems to me, if I throw my mind back, that there was a kind of pragmatism about this thing that, these are the same people who would say to us, fall in love by all means, but fall in love with sense. So the pragmatism that bounded the thing, you see, Caribbean gender relations has always been a ruthless space that could really destroy women. And I do believe that women have for decades, even respectable women bringing up respectable girls, have taught how to survive within this scenario. So I just brought it up because you're speaking about a kind of distance, like an imposition of middle class values in relation to a kind of othering. And from my recollection of walking a bit of the ground, or the othering, I'm not sure how big the othering was, meaning it just seemed to be that was life, right? And the gap between this middle class, middle class, church going, whatever, and the other set of values, like you have to decide whether to work it or not, was not a great gulf fixed. Okay? That.
Thanks very much. And in fact, I've had a similar conversation with my own grandmother. So I am familiar with the turn of phrase. I agree with you. I don't think it's a distance between middle class women who are perhaps married in nuclear families and working class women. Where I see the distance is in the relationship between the kind of masculine middle class writer, whether in kind of housing studies or the Beacon group, which I'm arguing are not so different after all, and the objects of their art. So, I'm thinking particularly about when, C.L.R. James or Alfred Mendez would go and live in a barrack yard, and then also, be able to withdraw from that space at will. And then the image of the kind of crack in the wall that Hazel Carvey points to, in Minty Alley. So no, I don't mean to suggest that there's a distance.
Yeah, I would, you may have already come across it. Have you read Gordon Wood's The Folk in Caribbean Literature?
Yes.
Right, because he deals with that complex kind of things.
Thank you.
Again, thank you for the presentation. Like Dr. Morgan, I haven't read Douglas, but I will. It's published in Beacon, is it?
Yes.
Yeah, good.
It's
yeah,
in
a comment
Trinidad.
and a question. comment. I mean, it's a small point. When you were talking about the term barracks and how it has become used throughout the Caribbean, you related it to the military barracks. But my hunch would be that it was much more closely related to the barracks on the plantation. Of course, the Caribbean islands had military barracks, but I think they were very different physically and in terms of architecture and so on. The main one in Port of Spain, the St. James Barrack, was and is, because it still stands, a very substantial stone building. But the barrack accommodation where the indentured workers live, and some ex-indentured workers on the sugar estates and the cocoa estate, I think were much more the obvious model in terms of physical layout and building construction than the military garrison. So that's just a comment. Yeah, my question, in your study of the Beacon and related literature and the way those writers portray gender relations and man-woman relationships, did you get the impression that physical abuse is a salient element in it? I ask because when you look at roughly comparable, maybe a bit later, but roughly comparable writing by Indo-Caribbean writers who are depicting village life perhaps rather than urban life, people like C. Prasad Naipaul, and even more bleakly, Harold Sunny Ladue. The ritual, you have to say, the ritual physical abuse of wives and partners is a very, very salient element in the way they see this. I mean, you spoke in Douglas of the Saturday evening rum drinking, but in the writings of these authors, the Saturday evening rum drinking precedes the Saturday evening wife beating. So do you see that in the Beacon literature? And if not, is this something interesting to think about?
Thanks very much, Dr. Brereton. So to respond to your first point, thank you, yes. Somehow in this, cutting down the longer chapter to this, I cut out that, and I was borrowing the military yard style comment from, I was following James Cummings' writings on barrack yard rooms and dwellers. As far as physical abuse, I do see it throughout the body of work, not to the same extent in Indo-Caribbean women's writing and Indo-Caribbean writing more generally later. For example, Elaine had been presumed unfaithful by her companion, and he beat her before leaving her. I think what's different about the depictions, and I'd have to think about this more, because as Gabby will know, I engage Indo-Caribbean women's writing and arts and other parts of my work. What's different, I think, in the Beacon group literatures is that the narrators tend to focus, they don't kind of dwell on the details of the beatings, and also they tend to emphasize the ways that women tended to navigate their relationships with men. So when men were present, they would perform a kind of piety or quietness, and when they were away, they could engage in relationships with their friends in different ways. So I think I'd have to think more about the navigations in this body of work versus a later. That's really helpful.
In the urban Port of Spain barrack yard, women almost certainly had more freedom to maneuver than in the very enclosed, inward-looking village, Indo-Caribbean village that those writers write about. So I'm sure you're right.
Yeah, and also in my broader work, I kind of want to think about, I want to, space across the rural and urban, so that'll be really helpful. Thank you.
And you have to take on board the politics of cross-gender representation, and where irony and all kinds of other things are playing into the representation of the gender issues.
Thank you.
I missed most of it, as you saw. So I'm not sure if my comment is going to be relevant, but just kind of taking up from what Professor Brereton is talking about the barracks. There's a book called Tika Singh's Wedding. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. I can't remember the name of the author right now. But it's set in Trinidad post-indentureship in a rural village. And there is a very good description of the barracks in that novel. So it might be something you might want to explore.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
And it might be interesting for you to go visit the military barracks in St. James. And I don't even know how many of them exist. I know when I was a child, I used to go and buy lunch, board. You know, your parents would pay you to go and have lunch every day. We used to board in a barrack yard. And it's a very interesting, but I don't know if they still exist.
It's a place.
No, a barrack, one of these barracks. The people would board the children for lunch.
Are there any in Port Elizabeth?
I was going to Bishop's, so I did that when I was a child. I don't know if it exists as a I don't know.
Thank you.
Very interesting and thought-provoking for me. A couple of questions. When you began, you situated this in contrast to the social policy writing around family. And I'm just wondering, as I'm not a literature scholar myself, so I don't know anything about this, but just wondering, it seems to me that there is a range of different discursive forms circulating around these very relationships, actually. And I was just wondering if in your focus in this chapter, you actually talk about how the writing strategies, like Dr. Morgan is mentioning irony or humor, what are the sort of Trinidadian writing strategies that help us to differ the space of these beacon writings from social policy and also particularly ethnographic writings that were happening around the region as well? And I would be interested in, because they're even travelogues, they're that kind of knowledge economy crosses genres, but because you're looking particularly at this attempt to create an indigenous mirror of Trinidadian life, I'd also be interested in seeing what were the writing strategies that they were working with precisely to counter what they may have seen as knowledge being driven by ethnographic, social policy, or colonial travelogue perspective.
Thank you. So I think throughout my dissertation in general, my original undergrad background is in literature, but I'm in, as you know, an interdisciplinary program, and I deal with, as you say, a lot of these different kind of genres of writing. What interested me last year when I was looking at some of these policy papers was that although they strike a different kind of tone than the Beacon Group writings, which I would, although he's not Trinidadian, but Wilson Harris kind of points out the kind of comedy of pathos present in writings of these period, the way that kind of humor is deployed to navigate difficult economic circumstances or just difficult life circumstances more generally, that the Beacon Group writers, I wanted to kind of complicate the kind of prevailing readings of the Beacon Group writers. So although they were sympathetic and although they deployed humor in that way, it seemed like the Barrack Yard, as I read further, was just kind of a counterpoint or an instrument, maybe not for shock value, perhaps that's too strong, but just to kind of rattle or unsettle middle class values. And so in that way, I think it reflects maybe not that they're in line with genres of ethnographic writing or social and housing policy, but rather that they're the site of a kind of contestation between colonial forms, whether those are colonial literary forms or other kinds of more official forms of writing and the indigenous literary tradition that they're trying to strike. And I was interested in it especially in the descriptions of the yards that they produced at the beginning of these short stories, as though they wanted to kind of orient their reader in a particular space, which indicated the sort of audience perhaps that they anticipated, and also the sometimes exacting language with which they described the barrack yard. So.
In your readings, did you pick up anything about the education system or the skills and knowledge base of some of these people who live in the barracks? You pick up anything in terms of...
That's a great question.
Thank you.
Very rarely. I think usually, if anything, it was because most of the women in these short stories are kept and therefore not traditionally employed. But I am thinking of the nurse. Her name escapes me, in Minty Alley.
Miss Rouse.
Yes, Miss Rouse, who I believe at the start of the novel is studying and often goes out to kind of practice nursing, but you don't see much about it. It's just kind of a device that takes her out of the yard and also marks her as, well, she's also mixed race, red, so-called, and it kind of serves to distinguish her from the residents of Minty Alley. So, but that would be interesting to
I want to just
investigate.
back up a point. It seems to me that there's something to be said about that cross-gender representation. Now, the women were not writing at that stage. I do not know of women writing anything that approximates barrack yard stories. Remember, these men are writing all this female triumph, what women are doing in their private social spaces, and presumably they're writing it from the outside because presumably they're not there, their eyes are not there, but they're writing a particular female-centered reality in relation to which they are on the outside, they are on the margins. Now, it was when the wave of writing started in the 1970s, the new voices that emerged, the correlation of the barrack yard, these are not barrack yard characters, would be people like in Hodges, Ma, and Tanti, and those are the women who are doing the same kinds of things, but not necessarily within a barrack yard framework. If your thesis is going to hold, it has to be that they represent, when you have same gender representation, there's something in the dynamic, something that you're saying that you should be able. I know we don't triangulate in literature or in cultural studies, but you should be able to see correlations in other kinds of literature. What happens when women are writing of those women as opposed to men writing about a public space, a female-centered space, which you are saying they are using for a particular ideological and political positioning. So I would, I'd be interested for you to go and find it out.
Sure.
And tell us.
Sure. That's definitely something. Although it wouldn't fit necessarily in the scope of the chapter. I would love to think about further. And part of the reason I think about this body of work and in this period of time in particular is a lot of feminist literary critics who write about Caribbean literature, I noticed there was kind of a dearth of those sorts of perspectives on this early period of Caribbean literature, and I wanted to think about, because women and also men who engage in these other sorts of sexual relationships figure so heavily in this body of work, how we can think about sexuality and its intersections with labor before the independence period, and what kinds of ways of life that's trying to carve out.
You came up with, did you come across Patricia Saunders', she has a chapter on this,
Yes.
the beacon.
Yes.
So, sorry, Kaneesha, in terms of this question of women's representations, I also wondered if you had thought about Beatrice Gregg, who was one of the contributors to the Beacon, right? And so there is a female voice. So to think about, maybe what we see through her, the lens of things that she's bringing in. The other thing that's so intriguing to me is, about the figure of the Dougla at this particular moment, and I find it interesting that James also brings to bear on her not just the mixedness question, but also her Guyanese-ness that's coming in. So it's interesting to think about her, that character, and maybe other characters you're coming up against in Mintiali, for example, not just in terms of their Dougla-ness as providing a kind of male sexual desirability for a male audience, but also how that's affecting the women, the exchange, female exchange. But the other thing to say about Beatrice Gregg, though, that I find interesting is she also seems to be the person who curates the India section of the Beacon, right? So maybe thinking about how India is appearing there through her lens versus the Dougla-ness and the male writers.
That's really helpful, thank you. As for Guyanese-ness, it reminds me of a part of the Dougla that I didn't include in this version, but when Celestine is trying to kind of rid Elaine of the spirit that she has on her, she says that it would be really convenient if Elaine could cross water, if perhaps she could return to Guyana for a time and come back, because crossing water would allow her to rid herself of the spirit. So that's one area that I see that emerging, but I'll think about that further, as well as Beatrice Gregg, who has a short sentence in the longer version. Thank you.
Great work.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing this chapter with us. Yeah, I too look forward to reading it.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you can elaborate a little on this.
So I've been kind of hopping around writing the dissertation. So this is actually my third chapter. My first chapter deals with Casaubon and kind of the crisis around free labor in the post-emancipation period. So where excess kind of emerges in that chapter is, I quote from some census surveys in the 1870s, and thinking about how people were kind of categorized or sorted based on the sort of work they did. And there's one category, it was either kind of described as variously employed, hopping from one odd job to another, or not employed. And I was thinking about how in those census documents, people are either categorized as traditionally employed or not employed at all. But that, and we can see this in in my reading, we can see this in some of Casaubon's paintings, that in these kinds of corners of Port of Spain or by East Dry River, we can see washerwomen conducting other kinds of work, or fishermen fishing at dawn, so before the start of the work day. And that sort of subsistence or form of various employment is kind of what I'm thinking about as excess. In this chapter in particular, and this is something I'm still working at, I'm trying to think about it in relationship to sexual labor and its relationship to wages. And
Are you seeing this as linked in any way to racialization of bodies?
Yeah, in a way, yes. And this is something that's in the longer version of this chapter. So when I think more about the kept woman as often Dougla in this body of work, thinking about the kind of contrast with the post-emancipation period in which African wage laborers and indentured Indian laborers were separated or presumably did not mix on estates, to a moment in which dwelling spaces see kept women as not only embodying the kind of legacies of both African slavery and Indian indentureship, but also kind of thwarting that previous, residential separation in a particular historical moment through their, the way they exercise free choice in partners, etc. So
I'll make one short comment. It just occurred to me, like, this term kept woman, it seems like it should be something really nice, like you're being kept. But actually, in a way, I think, from what I understand, Elaine seemed to be struggling a lot to make her rent and to feed herself, right? So to me, there seems to be some kind of dissonance in that too. You understand what I'm saying? Like the ethos that comes from a kept woman is like, you're living nicely. You don't have to worry, right? I think about a rich woman who is married, precisely that middle class woman in her respectable way. She's at home, while her husband works, not the woman who is struggling to make her rent. Just wanted to say that.
yeah, I definitely see that sort of contradiction there.
Okay. If there are no other questions, I would like to thank you very, very much. And let's give Kaneesha a round of applause.
Thank you guys so much.
Our presentation is excellent, and it sent me right back as though I was living in those days.